Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, Earth, which is still wrapped in a pandemic. Sadly, the vaccines that have been produced with miraculous speed in the past year, I wouldn't call it miraculous, that sounds too much like religiosity. No, incredible hard work, are still there. There's still a couple of billion people in countries on the world where the countries have not received a single dose yet of the vaccine. So that issue is still dominant. But we have a planet full of hazard, areas like the Himalayas that are profoundly hazardous and also profoundly crowded. And a disaster happened in recent days in a river valley, and that was increasingly aligned with hydropower dams, communities at risk. Several hundred people are still missing. The impacts go far beyond that valley because of the overall sense of vulnerability and risk in the Himalayas. I'll play a little bit of this Guardian imagery to give you a sense of the power of what unfolded. So today on this Sustain What webcast, we're going to look at this through the lens of journalism, people who are experts in policy when sources of risk are implicitly uncertain, but profoundly powerful. And the climate question, of course, how much of this relates to climate change, how much of it relates to other drivers of risk. And I have guests from Nepal, India, one who's Canadian, at a Canadian university, but in Europe right now, and here at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, Ben Orlove. It's great to be able to pull together a discussion on this incident and the wider issues and opportunities that it raises. I'm Andy Revkin. I'm at the Earth Institute of Columbia University, building the Initiative on Sustainability and Communication. And here we're going to talk about what's going on even now in that distant region, distant to many people, but not to those who live there, obviously. I thought we'd start with Joydeep Gupta, who is were you the founder of the Third Pole, Joydeep?
Well, Isabel Hilton and I, yeah.
The thirdpole.net is essentially a news service, a news collaboration across that region of South Asia. You're based in New Delhi, and you're also a very important figure in Earth Journalism Network. We're also going to hear from Ramesh Bhushal, who's a journalist, who's the South Asia director, essentially, for that network. Kashish Das Shrestha, who is Nepal-born and living in the United States, who's been on my blog at the New York Times many times, and he was illuminating both the earthquake and issues around hydropower in the Himalayas. And Miriam Matejova, who's a fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, Canada. She specializes in global environmental politics, disaster risk, and security. And her recent work was cited in an Earth Institute Glacier Hub blog post paper on this issue of unpredictability. How do you get ahead of unpredictability in areas with multiple threats like the ones we're seeing unfolding? Ben Orlove, my colleague and friend here at the Earth Institute, is a longtime author of the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an anthropologist. We need more anthropologists studying human behavior, in cases of risk and opportunity. And he was the founder of Glacier Hub, an essential blog on this kind of issue. So it's great to have you all here. But again, circling back to Joydeep. So how are things, what's the Indian press, how are they dealing with this issue, and what's unfolding there right now from your vantage point?
Hi, Andy. Hi, everybody else. It's a huge story in India. It, of course, was the main story the next day and that same day on television and on all the web media outlets and in newspapers the next morning. And it continues to be front page news because we continue to have somewhere around 200 people still missing. Right. And one of the issues of poor governance is that we actually don't know how many people are missing. We don't know how many people were working in those tunnels. because it's not they were not direct employees of the people of the companies that were building those dams. They go through contractor and subcontractor and subcontractor.
Right.
At the end of it, the laborers who are actually inside the tunnel, nobody seems to have kept account for it.
Yeah, I'm showing this video that was playing nonstop on Indian TV. This is from the 10th, so just a day or so ago, showing workers who had scrambled to the top of the building and then were washed away tragically. It's unimaginable to think that, again, early warning wasn't possible. But we can get to the geophysics and hydrology of that in a few minutes, perhaps. But there are those at Columbia and elsewhere who've been working on ways to foster better early warning. It's just a shame. So I can see why that would be a persistent issue right now.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And as far as the story itself is concerned, there has been, as I said, blanket coverage. There has been, and the newspapers and the websites have done better than TV when it comes to the fundamentals of the geophysics of climate change. TV has, by and large, stuck to the rescue effort, which is important, but they haven't gone, by and large, they haven't gone beyond that as to why it happened. Newspapers and all the web outlets are looking at that very carefully. Right now, we seem to be having one predominant theory and another theory which is also being supported by some very well-known scientists.
Right, and we can get to that a little bit with Ben. Perhaps there's again geophysics, and there's climate, and there's ice, and there's rock, and all of those things can be changing at once. The Himalayas are a very young mountain range, as I said in the title of this episode, and lots of things are falling down even as they're rising up. And of course, rock can respond to temperature and ice pressure as well. Ben, maybe you could pop in, and then we'll get to Ramesh to give the vantage point from Nepal. So Ben, when you look at this from a sort of, as an author of the IPCC, you've really been dug in at that interface of these various data flows, along with how humans respond. What was your first reaction to how this unfolded and how the story unfolded? Oh, Ben, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Thanks. So initially, there is some thought that this was an example of a familiar kind of flood, which is a glacial lake outburst flood, where an entire lake forms as glaciers melt, and then all that water flows downstream, tremendous velocities. But it's been clear from satellite imagery and an amazing group of geoscientists through the American and European geophysical unions who really assembled the story, found the satellite pictures. It's clear that there is a landslide that started high up on a mountain. Then this vast amount of rock and ice fell 2 kilometers. Just imagine dropping a chunk of a mountain 2 kilometers, and then it bounces off the sides of the valley, hits the valley floor, creates a huge plume of dust, catches a lot of debris from earlier floods, and then vast amount are rushing downstream. The water comes from the ice that was melting from high up on the mountain. So briefly, there's a question of how this is connected to climate change. We could do that now or later.
Let's do that later. But what you just described was a pretty astounding picture of physics at work. Again, a mix of factors for sure. And I will say, like many journalists, I jumped to a conclusion. This is an early tweet of mine, glacial outbursts, because that was what was in my head, having written about climate change for 30 years and knowing 35 and knowing what was poised up there, so I have this habit, and a lot of us have a habit writing our headlines or the like of jumping to conclusions. And here's a good case of making sure, stepping back, verifying, not doing what I did that day. And, I tweeted a lot about it going forward. So this brings us back to the journalistic realm, and maybe Ramesh and then Kashish. And then we get to Miriam on the grand picture. Thank you again for being part of this today from Europe. So Ramesh, you've written this story, the predictive story, many times, you and Joydeep. And Kashish, you've been warning about the landslide risk specifically for years, including on my blog at the New York Times. But Ramesh, what came to mind for you, when this news was breaking?
Andy, thank you very much. When this kind of events happen, I always recall one moment. In 2009, I was in Mount Everest Base Camp. There was a cabinet meeting of the Nepal's ministers. The prime minister was there. We were there to tell the world, and they wanted to tell the world that you need to act faster because the Himalayas are melting. There won't be snow in the mountains. And I was there was one Sherpa, local Sherpa, was standing next to me, and then he just spoke out of blue to me saying, "Why do you all guys come and say that we will die if there is glacial lake outburst flood? We know that. We don't need to come and tell. Journalists come, scientists come, now politicians are coming. Everybody is telling the story of death. So we don't want to hear that. We need the story of life. We need to live. We can't do anything, and you just guys, make us like panic. This is not fair." And he was like very, very he was out of blue. He started talking to me, and then I always, when this kind of events happen, I always recall that the quote that I got from this guy. He told to me that how fearful it is to live in those beautiful mountains. We take pictures, we go there, we trek, we do climbings. So that is the local story whenever it happens. So every time this kind of events happen, it is a chaos for journalists. It is more like a traumatized. You're traumatized because once these kind of events occur, then you are really in trouble to figure out what has happened. You can't get information. You can't even talk to scientists. They also say, we don't know much about it, but let me figure out. And you have like a deadline to tell this story, right? So there was this kind of event had happened in 2012 in Nepal, in western Nepal's city river. It is next to the second largest city in Nepal. A same kind of event happened. So people started saying this is a glacial lake outburst flood, and then later we knew that it was a kind of a huge mass failure, and then things started to become like the same. It happened in Uttarakhand. So this kind of confusions around, and the way we have to report, so it is like a kind of normal. It happens. That's the kind of things that happens always, and you can't predict. You can't get people to really tell you what is happening, and afterwards things get a bit clear, but still we are debating like after a few days what is the cause, right? So this kind of things are happening because we don't have a regular, consistent data providing authorities, not monitoring as well, and there is not an authority who can tell us in better way. That is kind of thing.
So that leads to a lot of challenges for journalists, and I guess for policymakers too, who seem to rely so often on the need for clarity. And maybe I'm going to jump the line and get Miriam in here to discuss just briefly, and then we'll get back to the regional context, that bigger lens on this. Miriam, you were a co-author on a paper that gets into something I've really focused on a lot in recent years, which is the normal nature of uncertainty and enduring uncertainty, and even what I would call known unknowables, basically where science won't advance fast enough to give you clarity. And this paper that was covered in the Glacier Hub blog, Embracing the Darkness, Methods for Tackling Uncertainty and Complexity in Environmental Disaster Risks. And you get into some specifics related to events just like this one. So as this news was unfolding, thinking it with that broader picture in mind, what came to mind for you?
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much for having me on. Before actually I answered it, I really want to quickly say, because my institution will not be happy if I don't say this. So the reason I'm in Europe is that I am also assistant professor at Glacier University in Brno, so I'm in Czech Republic right now.
Great.
But I'm also a fellow at Norman Paterson School, so okay. Both things. And so yes, so this paper, and thank you very much for highlighting that. I'm really glad it's getting attention. This paper is co-authored with Dr. Chad Briggs And he and I have been working together. We're friends, we're co-authors. We have been working on scenarios and simulations or board games. Me for about almost 10 years now, he actually much longer than that. And what we do really is we try to make up disasters. We just make up the unthinkable, most unrealistic scenarios, and not just the two of us, but we like to get experts together, policymakers, academics, students as well. So we like to get them together and try to make up these disasters that people that could happen. Are unlikely, but they are not impossible. So when I heard of this disaster, my first thought was, "Oh, here's another one, right? Like here's something that could have been a scenario that we could have made up, but we didn't. But it's quite similar." And in terms of the kind of big picture, I think what we're seeing and what Chad and I have seen. And tried to draw attention to for quite some time is this role of uncertainty, as I mentioned. Humans, policymakers, planners, probably scholars too, we don't like to deal with uncertainty. We often acknowledge it, but then we kind of put it aside and say, okay, it's there, but we're not going to touch it. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, right? We're not engaging with it. We're not trying to work with it. And then that kind of seeps into this inappropriate or lack of planning for disasters, especially for disasters that are difficult to imagine.
Yeah, and I don't know, it seems so far from where we're at to getting policy makers and planners to really integrate that in a normal way into how we plan. Maybe, Ben, you've, again, in your role in the IPCC, you're very much at that. You're one of those people who's trying to bridge, even within the climate panel, the data, the working group 1, what's happening to the climate, the working group 2, adaptation and impacts, and working group 3, what do we do about it? You're very much navigating that whole arena. So if you could rank on a scale of maybe 1 to 10, the lessons from work, like the work that Miriam does on deep uncertainty, where are we at in getting that into the IPCC process?
So thanks for asking. And in fact, the IPCC does talk very specifically about deep uncertainty and seeks to distinguish ordinary uncertainty, which faces everything. All life, the future is never fully known. And then the deep uncertainty are these areas where we, as Miriam is explaining, lack a full understanding of how the systems work. And there are steps that can be taken. There are many, the pandemic shows us many of the signs of uncertainty and deep uncertainty. And I think we can balance the discussion of uncertainty with the discussion of risk, because risk itself is always probabilistic. In that sense, it's never fully certain. And I think that there are many, though there are many details of this case that were uncertain, there were many familiar risks. I think that's a point that people are bringing forward. So it's a question of the risks are changing because of climate change, but there's
Ben has frozen just for a second there, which gives us a good opportunity to jump to Kashish. Ben, I'm sure he'll come back. And this is exactly the point that seems to distinguish what just happened from some of the stuff that Miriam was describing. Ben, you froze briefly, but we'll get back to you in a second. Kashish, you pitched this to me. I think we first interacted like way back in 2012 or something. Yeah. So this was around 2000.
This is 15.
2015. I can't read my small screen. You and a friend, a colleague in Nepal, wrote a guest piece for .earth. 1-2 punch of earthquakes and landslides exposes hydropower vulnerability in Nepal. Now that was Nepal specific, but of course it's Himalayan. It's a Himalayan reality, and even in the Andes, some of these issues exist as well. So, what did it feel like for you waking up and seeing this news?
I mean, my first thought was, it went, it may sound strange, but it went to Nepal because seeing that news and watching that footage the Indian media had tweeted, it was just like, it reminded me of the incident that Ramesh was talking about earlier, the 2012 Seti floods in Pokhara, one of the largest cities in Nepal. And so it just made me think, like Nepal is completely unprepared for something like this. So it was a stressful acknowledgement of this reality.
So I should ask you and Ramesh and Kashish, even though you're in the United States right now, out in the West, you track Nepali news, and Ramesh, you're in the news process in Nepal. How is this reverberating there? Are people writing that story? This is like a standard journalism story, is this could happen here too, that story. So is that being written in Nepal right now?
Yeah, I mean, there are reports being prepared by the mainstream media, but overall, I mean, it is not that much deeply reported. It is just taken as an incident, like 200 people died or something happened. There are some kind of videos, but they are not linking that to Nepal. Actually, in a way, they should have been doing it,
Wow.
because same kind of incidents that happened in Nepal. And the most important story of this time is there is no lesson learned from these countries. There has been a lot of incidents in the past, same kind of incident, same kind of events happened, but the countries are not learning from each other. And there is no kind of a discussion among the countries, or even in media outlets, on how we failed to really understand and learn from the past events, right? So that has not been in the mainstream media. We should have been a kind of a debate that should have sparked, but it is not happening.
Well, that's distressing. Maybe I like to pivot these conversations toward what can we do, and maybe can help facilitate a briefing for journalists in Nepal on with you and others to say, this is your story too. That seems to be a glaring opportunity. Joydeep too, with the Earth Journalism Network and Third Pole, with that networked approach to journalism that you all have. Is there an opportunity to make sure that the relevant implications of what's happened in this one incident reverberate all around that region?
Yeah, sure. There is.
I mean, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, for sure.
So, between 2013, 14, and 15, I moderated and organized a workshop for USAID and WWF for environment journalists. It's called Connecting the Dots. And so it was basically about taking things like this and helping working journalists kind of connect the dots on what is climate related, what is not climate, just basically capacity building of environment reporting in Nepal. And it was actually a really successful model. But the problem is environment issues are sort of glamorous now for Nepali media, but for a very long time, it's not really, politics is the bread and butter of Nepali media. That's what drives the media. And it reflects in governance too. Like the environment ministry itself is always kind of like the last thing handed out by the ruling party if they need to make a coalition or something. It's like a token ministry. And so these issues have always been in the backseat for Nepal. And I read some of the coverage that Ramesh was talking about, with this Uttarakhand event, and everyone quickly wrote, yes, it can happen in Nepal. And it's true. There's that very superficial level of discussion. Oh, this can also happen in Nepal, bluff. But there's no sustained discourse. The government is completely occupied in an intra-party conflict and has no thought process on these events unfolding in the region. And in a few months, we're in February now. By July, we're going to have floods in Nepal. It's the South Asian monsoon. But there's no sense of preparing for it. There's no sense of acknowledging what's happened in the region. So it's a bit of a disarray. And surprised that media continues to give this whatever space that it does get for issues like this, actually.
Boy, well, we're getting at the heart of what I see as the big challenge here, which is even when the data are clear, even when a specific incident is clearly indicative of a wider risk, we still seem to have, whether it's the media, the policy arena, the way our politics works, a profound gap. And I've been using the hashtag for years, blah, 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 bang. And I've written at least 10 pieces when I was at the Times that had that phrase in it. How are we stuck with blah, 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 bang? And I still wonder. I do see opportunities, especially through networked approaches to coverage of getting it better. We have a significant new burst of viewership coming in here. So I'd like to focus again on that. Let's get back to this incident. And Joydeep, we didn't really talk about the wider sort of the political context in India right now. Is it just that there's so many other issues that even something like this gets buried when it comes to actually changing? I just am haunted by the footage of those workers washed from the top of a facility that they could have evacuated from.
Yeah, it's quite amazing failure of governance. I would say willful failure of governance, because what we are talking about here, when we talk about the workers on that facility, we're talking about construction of a hydropower project. Despite the orders of the Supreme Court of India, despite the government of India telling the Supreme Court that there will be no such projects at that altitude.
Oh, is that right?
Yes. And this, and basically what happened was that there were two facilities that got ruined in this flash flood. The one above was a small hydroelectric plant, almost totally built, and that got completely washed away. And in the process, the huge concrete blocks of that plant went and hit the plant below,
right.
Which is one of the major reasons why the rescue is stuck, because huge blocks of concrete are blocking the tunnel. They're caught inside the tunnel. They've broken the second dam, and they're blocking access of rescuers into the tunnel. So it's also a serious warning against this cascade of dams. So if you have a cascade of dams and you have a flash flood, then you have a very special case where the first dam, when it gets broken up like this, goes and hits the second dam and increases the problem. So yes, there are serious failures of governance here. I don't know if you remember, but in 2013, the same state of Uttarakhand faced a huge gulf, and a very large number of people, and the estimate is 5,700 people died. So after that, all these pious promises were made by the Supreme Court, by the federal government, by the then chief minister of that state. Nothing seems to have been kept. And the second dam, which has the tunnel right now, that is a state-owned enterprise. It's a public sector enterprise. It's state-owned. So they were building there despite the promise of their owners to the Supreme Court not to do so.
Well,
so what do you say? What do you say after that?
You say that the news media have a lot of responsibility to jump on that angle of the story.
We have been I think everybody, the entire news media has been reporting that, and not just now. Now it has reached a peak because of this incident, but it has been followed up by both the internet media and print media. Not so much by TV, unfortunately. But it has been followed up over the years. So it is not so much a problem of the messenger as the message not having the impact.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Ben, you had a comment?
Yes, very much thank Joydeep, everyone, for all these comments and these multiple perspectives. And I'd like to build on Joydeep's comment on the failure of governance. Certainly, there's a failure of governance in India, and a country that's expanding its hydropower and concerned about energy and concerned about moving away from coal. I'm wondering whether there's a failure of global governance as well. The funding for these dams, some of it comes from the World Bank and from the Asian Development Bank, from international sources. And I think in a way there's kind of almost a deliberate neglect. There's a distinction between the big hydropower dams that flood valleys, move villages. Those are bad. We don't like those. And then there are the small, cute little run-of-the-river dams, which we think just take water from the river and run it down a little tunnel and not so destructive. But there's no regulation of what's a run-of-the-river dam. This one had a 22-meter high dam, 6-story building, as if it were next to nothing. So there could be dams don't care what country they're built in. Hydro engineers learn from country to country, but the agencies that govern the dams, that make the loans, that set the standards, they're sort of neglecting this. And so I see that as a failure of global governance. And I welcome
Interesting
from others.
So the finance, that finance too, right? You know, who's lending for which projects?
Also, Andrew, I mean, the sole, the sole strategy has been like ignorance is the strength. That is being used, like, and if you ignore, you feel that is your strength, right? That has been a kind of a strategy of all governments. I just traveled to one of the rivers in Western Nepal. We are publishing a story tomorrow, and they are building like 263 meters tall dam in Nepal. So imagine, there is a kind of a there's increasing kind of a feelings in Nepal or in South Asia that they call it disease of gigantism. They feel that if you have a big infrastructure, you are going to rule. I mean, you are great, you are big. This kind of disease of gigantism is so high, and it is really increasing. And then they are producing 1,200 megawatts of electricity. They are making a kind of a 45-kilometer long reservoir and 263 meters tall dam, which is one of the tallest dam in the world. Imagine, the things are, people are really moving aggressively in this fragile and, in a region which is very uncertain, and it is more uncertain due to climate change. And there is no realization that we will be able to, there is no realization of that what do you call catastrophe that will happen, or disaster that will happen. So this is really increasing. That is something we need to worry about, actually.
Yeah. Let me get. I'm going to bring in one more angle, which suddenly I'm getting a lot of feedback. So if you have headphones or and mute if you can. Actually, Ben, you were a co-author on a piece a couple of years ago. What am I saying? A couple of months ago, on the Glacier Hub blog about the early warning thing. So obviously there's a lot that's wrong right now with the way things are working. And that means early warning is essential, even while we work out these systemic challenges related to finance and governance. And I'm just going to put it on the screen, this piece that you co-authored as a way to discuss it. So that was based in work in Bhutan, I think. Could you just describe what's the forefront of getting better warning at the very least while we work out these other tough issues?
So these some of these floods the amount of time it takes from the flood being detected to reach the populated areas can vary from some minutes to sometimes a number of hours. So that unlike when earthquakes hit, you sometimes get seconds of warning. Mexico has built systems that'll give people 50 seconds of warning, and that's worth it. But with these floods, there are multiple ways to detect them. They start high up in mountains and travel down even to where the dams are and then the villages below. So if you can give people a half hour or a few hours, you can prepare them to evacuate. It's made quite a difference.
And there's seismic signals that can do that.
Easily. That's what I was checking to see what we do with the hydropower dams here in the United States. Washington State, a lot of hydropower, a lot of geohazards, earthquakes, volcanoes, and they're very densely networked with sensors and warnings. And there's a lot of training locally so that people are prepared. They understand what the sirens mean. They know where to go.
So more crosstalk there, perhaps, if we can have some Indian, well, let's say Himalayan U.S. conversations about early warning systems, about seismic and integrating seismic signals. Yes, Joydeep.
Actually, we have those rules. We have those laws.
Yeah,
Every hydroelectric project, including the ones which got washed away, is supposed to be equipped with an early warning system, signal. It's all there. The SMS systems, the WhatsApp systems, all of that are there. But somebody has to trigger it. And it seems, again, a very weird failure of governance that because it was Sunday, whoever is supposed to trigger it was on a holiday. So so flash floods don't worry about Sundays,
They don't. And actually, I just see that right now the third poll had a really good piece on this very point. Maybe Ramesh, briefly, you could talk about is there a way to make so much of this leads back to a systemic problem. You can do great stories, but if they're not being heard and not being responded to, and if a government, as Joydeep said, has regulations and technology, and as Miriam has indicated, we have scenarios. What can we have a little list from each of you, maybe in the next few minutes, of things, some little angle that might give us a little more leverage between information and action? And starting with Ramesh. I'm going to show that piece that was published.
Yeah, I mean there are some initiatives that have been installed as a early warning system in Nepal, in China. When these kind of events are more transboundary in nature, it is more complex. For example, if there is a glacial lake outburst flood in Tibet, and then if there is not a communication system that tells us, or people in downstream, it is really, really bad for the people who are downstream. So this transboundary nature of the Himalayas, we share the Himalayas in between the countries, and there is not a kind of mechanism that will ensure that these kind of informations are delivered in a regular basis. And I was traveling to one of the rivers, Kosi River, which flows all the way from Tibet to Nepal and goes to India. And then there were some early warning systems, but people, if event doesn't happen for a few years, they start thinking that you don't need to do it, right? So they don't really think about it, and then this kind of things get defunct, or this kind of things are installed by some fundings, by some projects, and then when the project isn't there, then it gets into it gets defunct, right? So this kind of the sustainability of these initiatives are not there in place, which is very important. We need to install those systems both within the country and in between the country. There should be a kind of a mechanism that will tell the people about this information. That is pretty much lacking in the region, though there are some initiatives in the region.
So interesting. By the way, what you just articulated, I'm thinking back to a conversation I had about COVID-19 and the pandemic in the United States. And this relates to Miriam's arena of security and intelligence and responsiveness. Alice Hill, who had been the climate adaptation person for the Obama White House, she was also involved with bioterrorism preparation and pandemics. And she said, you have to run the drill. You can't just have the scenario. You have to run the drill. And that's the only way if the ventilators in a hospital were maintained in some warehouse. The only way you have that responsiveness is by doing the practice. And does that feel like it's essential? Maybe Miriam, could you dive in on that? And Ben, too, as an anthropologist focused on climate.
Yes, thank you. Yes, absolutely. This is and you're just getting into this one part of that paper and mine and Chad's work on simulations and war games. So simulations, or we call them war games, it's really the same thing in this context, allow policymakers or planners or whoever is running through them to actually practice out the scenarios. So we can come up with different terrifying scenarios, but if we just stop there, then it doesn't really do much, right? So what we are proposing is take the scenarios, run them through, use them in simulations with people who could use them, who could benefit from them, and then you'll see how people react under the conditions of uncertainty. You can see what constraints, institutional resource constraints, other constraints are out there, and then what then consequently we have to focus on, what we have to improve, where we have to do better. So yes, I absolutely agree. It's not enough to just imagine disasters. We have to run through them given the existing constraints. And that includes, as I said, resources, institutions, but also political, economic, and otherwise, depending on context.
So, and Ben, again, I've been writing about the IPCC since before it existed, since 1988. And it's won a Nobel Prize. It's done remarkable work, and yet, whether it's decarbonization or resilience, sometimes it feels like what does it feel like to be in that process for a long time and see the world kind of just grind on?
The IPCC does the assessments, provides the information, and so we look to the UNFCCC and the Conference of Parties and hope for progress there, and certainly all eyes turn to Glasgow. But I just want to build on what Ramesh and Miriam said. I think it really, those 2 points complement each other, because Miriam is saying that, yes, you need to really build kind of habits. You need to have regular training. Certainly, fire drills are a good example of a 19th century hazard that devastated cities. And so there's a well-institutionalized system of preparing people to exit burning buildings. So we have to deal with more recent questions. And then Ramesh was bringing forward the point of short-term funding, that the early warning systems projects, presumably there's pilot funding that would develop them. But I think I'll just say it's an act of hypocrisy for projects to develop early warning systems, knowing that there will not be that, not looking to see that there'll be that handoff, not working, not building the partnerships, so that if there's funding to install the systems, and sometimes they're expensive to install, how are they going to be maintained? You need both the funding and the training and the will. So we're seeing these different these gaps that led those people to be washed off that dam.
Yeah. Kashish, I was just going to turn to you, because you've been involved in policy on sustainability and resilience in Nepal directly too, not just writing about it. So what comes to mind? Obviously, you had something in mind already too.
Just quickly wanted to also touch on the dam and early warning system. I was talking to a colleague of mine who is building a 75 megawatt hydro project in Nepal right now, and I asked him, what do you make of this event in Uttarakhand? And he said, well, if it happens, it happens. There's very little we can do if Mother Nature
oh my God
behaves this way. And then I said, but is there a government requirement for early warning system, or do you guys put it in place? What does the EIA say, the Environment Impact Assessment? And he said, we have an early warning system for floods 10 kilometers upstream. So that, and I was like, 10 kilometers to me does not sound like a lot of time in case there is a flash flood. But he basically said there are no, as a project developer, they really have no, set things for them to do.
Yeah. I'm just showing that piece you co-wrote in 2015 again.
And we had this landslide event in 2014, the photo on your screen right now. And, that knocked out 2 hydropower projects. At the time, I think that was about 150 megawatts, which was, at the time, almost 1/8 of the country's entire built capacity, for electric generation. And that was one incident, one landslide. On policy, there was this really funny moment. I was moderating a talk program for EC-Mode. EC-Mode is the International Mountain Development Organization that's headquartered in Nepal, but it's a regional organization that works in the Himalayan Kush region. And so we had the director of EC-Mode there. We had the vice chair of Nepal's National Planning Commission, who acts as the chairman of ECMOD, because Nepal is the secretariat for this organization. And we had Gagan Thapa, who was the chairman of of a parliamentary committee that looks into these issues. And in the middle of the conversation, I asked him, Chairman, you are here, member of the parliament, you are here. And so ECMOD produces the most fantastic reports on risk warnings, risk mitigation. They have all kinds of policy, kind of like ICPP. And then I asked him, so Mr. Vice Chair, you are the chairman of ECMOD. Do you, and he has the jurisdiction to greenlight all infrastructure projects in Nepal. So I said, does the ECMOD report ever come across you in your office when you plan all this?
Oh, you just froze too. Who does that resonate for? Oh, Joydeep, maybe you could jump in.
Right. Okay. There's an interesting thing that happened last Sunday. Early warning worked. Actually, early warning worked. Because what happened last Sunday was that villagers standing on hilltops in the upstream villages went live on Facebook,
right?
Started tweeting, started sending WhatsApp messages all over, and people downstream did evacuate. So early warning, people to people, actually worked. Institution to institution did not work. And company to company, hydro project to hydro project did not work. But people to people, community to community, it actually worked. We have earlier examples of this in transboundary issues. I know at least of two. A flash flood starting in Bhutan, people in Bhutan and people in India being in the same WhatsApp group, putting out immediate warnings. Same with the Nepal-India border. So right. I think there is a case here for actually rethinking how we provide early warning, not just, I would expand it to governance, how would at least bring early warning to the people-to-people level where it actually works.
I would love to talk more about that and do some more sessions on that. I remember during the Nepal earthquake, this was a rescue where people were in an actual live conversation with authorities. People were directing helicopters to villages using Facebook and WhatsApp. And the more I think about the world, the more I see that distributed capacity with some training and some connection to data as underappreciated. We were all focused on institutions. And
can I go back to the
yeah. Sorry, you had frozen there at one point.
Yeah. So ECMOD makes all this report, and it never comes across the chairman of the organization who designs all these projects for Nepal. But on a policy level, the other challenge we have is a lot of these disasters in Nepal. If you fly across Nepal, any flight, and you see a landslide, you can guarantee that there's a road project happening nearby. There are so many road projects being developed, and essentially, I can guarantee you 90% of the landslides that happen in Nepal in the last decade is because of these road projects. And monsoon or winter snow, it just makes it worse. But it's local governance and national projects.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I also wrote a story on why the landslides are so deadly in Nepal a few months ago for third poll, and then I knew that there are like 50,000 kilometers of road has been built in last 2 decades, and most of the road is non-engineered, which means you take a bulldozer, you cut a hilltop, and take it wherever you want. It is like kind of a rampant, ad hoc road building that is moving on. And the problem is it is moving upward, which means there are dams, there are, off-roads. And the problem is those people who are living in the hills, they started to move down in the road, in doing businesses and doing new settlements. And these are mostly informal and formal settlements that are really in the riverbanks. So the road doesn't only bring, the road only doesn't go there, but it brings people from uphill to downhill on the bank of the river. And when there's a disaster, those people are the ones who have to face this front. And they are the ones who are who are the victims in most of the times, and that's why the casualties are much more higher in last few years.
Well,
And
sorry.
And I just want to add to what Ramesh just said. There's this other crisis, and I think this is a crisis in India as well, where illegal mining of hills and riverbeds and sand has just made any monsoon or water-related disaster so much more worse in Nepal. We have entire small hills that have been mined out. I mean, they're like gigantic natural structures that don't exist anymore because of mining in the last couple of years. And so the rain catchment area, any number of things affected. It's a huge problem. And going back to politics and policy, a lot of these businesses are, operating with political patronage. And in fact, local governments in Nepal now have the right to exploit natural resources for their local revenue. So what used to be illegal mining is now going to be a formal source of revenue for local governments. And so it's really strange. And policy-wise, we had the Prime Minister of Nepal at the UN General Assembly last September giving a wonderful speech about how Nepal is committed to sustainability and forest generation and all of that. That very week, his government in Nepal was plotting to clear out an entire old growth forest for an airport with no funding. So you have thousands of acres of forest that is actively trying to clear out and build a concrete structure in a floodplain. And he's on international platform talking about how Nepal is committed to sustainability and all of that. So there's this direct disconnect with what governments like that of Nepal will say to its international development partners who are funding a lot of these activities and what they actually do at home. And
that gets back to what Ben was saying about international relations actually matter.
Exactly. And what's happened? Yeah. Sorry, yes, Miriam, go ahead.
Miriam has a thought too.
Thank you. Yes, I have been thinking about this issue of global governance in this context of hydropower development in India, and it really strikes me as unfortunate that we have been hearing a lot about the failure of global governance in fighting climate change, right? Like that's a big thing. So it's just, I don't want to say ironic, unfortunate, right? That hydropower is actually viewed as, as a way to, get away from fossil fuel burning energy sources, right? And so it's hydropower is the answer, but yet we're just not getting that right either. So it's just a thought, a comment, right? It's unfortunate.
It's interesting. Miriam said that in 2009, I interviewed the Minister of Energy in Nepal. And at that time, Nepal had announced that it was going to build, I think, 10,000 megawatts of hydropower projects in 10 years. So I asked him, the ICPP report says this is going to be a problem. It doesn't look like a good energy security project for Nepal, given climate change. And his answer literally was, it's not about climate change. It's about being able to sell as many hydropower licenses as we can in the next couple of years. So it wasn't about energy security. It wasn't about any of these issues. It was about revenue generation and the money it brings into, privately and publicly to these people involved by selling these hydro projects. And this was the Minister of Energy answering my question about how does climate change affect Nepal's hydro plans. He said it's irrelevant. it's about selling the projects. It's not about addressing these issues. And it's a real crisis. And in Nepal, I saw this New York Times report that said, India had ignored a lot of warnings and advice about projects like this. It's the same thing in Nepal. And so we're kind of stuck in the situation, I think, in South Asia, where America was with Trump and environment regulations the last 4 years. And so it's a really, really difficult situation because politics is what governs it. And if the prime minister, I'll give you this really, really surreal situation. In Nepal, if you are investing in an infrastructure project, you don't have to show your source of income. So when this prime minister won his election, he announced that he wanted to allow a period where black money could be converted into white money. And so that drew a lot of criticism. And then so it kind of went silent. And when we announced his first budget, the budget said that if you are investing in large infrastructure projects such as railroads and roads and highways and all of that, then you don't have to show a source of income. So it's almost like if you want a money laundering operation, go pick any random infrastructure project in Nepal, and you could it'll work for you.
Oh my God. Well, there's clearly a lot of work to be done in several dimensions, which is why these programs that I do are there's no closure. They're all about directionality. Yeah.
There's one more thing we haven't talked about. I mean, there's a big giant in the room, the face of this thing is climate change or mountains. But if you see, the Himalayas are the world's most militarized areas in the world. So the military movement is so high. They are building huge number of roads strategic roads across the Himalayas, both in India and China. So these big giants are really playing out for this security thing. And that is really hampering, a lot of things. The transboundary cooperation, the scientific cooperation is lacking because they can't just go there because it is militarized and it is so hard to get approval to do research work. So you can't do research by yourself. You can't collaborate with other countries. It's a chaos actually, and that is where we lack adequate information to tell people and policymakers. And that is the main story that is really pushing this information ecosystem backward.
Wow, that's so powerful, and I think it's a vital lens to put on here. You're reminding me so much of the Amazon in the 1980s when I was writing my book about development in the Amazon in 1989 after the murder of Chico Mendes. It was all a military. Well, I wouldn't say all, but the military push to occupy the Amazon as a strategic imperative is just what you're describing here in the Himalayas.
Yeah.
And I see Joydeep has his.
Yeah, I'm very glad you brought up the Amazon, because what I wanted to say is that yes, South Asia is a bad case, and it's a terrible example, but it's not the only one. No. We have the same problem. China's latest 5-year plan very clearly says its way to get out of coal-fired power generation is to build more hydro projects, and exactly the same thing is happening in China. The same kind of thing is happening in Brazil. The same kind of thing happens in many countries of Southeast Asia and many countries in Africa. So this is a global problem, and the problem is not. Of course, we should, as journalists, have louder voices and write and report on this more. But the problem that I do not know how to solve, because at the end of the day, I'm a journalist, is that even after we do 20 stories or 2,000 stories, if the policymakers pay no attention to those, then what? That is where people like Miriam and Ben come in. And so that is the big question, that if all our reporting is not having policy impacts, then what?
Well, and I guess what the hidden story there too is when military or strategic imperatives dominate, governments are not going to listen to the press. Yeah. Unless you have a real functioning democracy. And even here in the United States, of course, that's been tested dearly. We are at the end of our hour. We can go another couple of minutes.
I just want to add to what Joydeep has just said. That's the same situation in Nepal right now. And I don't know if you remember the Monsanto case, and we did some of that on .earth as well. And so what that showed to me was, just for context, Monsanto was coming to Nepal for a large agriculture project. There's a lot of uproar. I'd done a piece that Andy shared on the New York Times, .earth, and then that created a lot of pressure on the American side, who wanted to then backtrack on the project. And so things kind of unfolded. But one of the lessons from that is, a lot of the times these strongmen local governments or national governments, they don't really care for local protests or local media, right? They feel like they can just squash them and move on with their business. Where it does become useful is when their bilateral partner or when the multilateral partner funding these issues kind of shape the agenda for a good cause. Of course, this is a slippery slope. It can go either way. But for example, if USAID is the Americans are one of the largest donors for conservation work in Nepal, and so if the American taxpayers or USAID took a stand where it said this project is clearly counterintuitive to Nepal's sustainable development commitments, and so we urge you, because there's a lot of funding attached for the Nepal government's budget from these partners, and so. And India is now, there's a movement. India is like stop outside interference or whatever with the farmers' protest, and I guess that can happen. But when national governments refuse to listen to experts and critics and public, the only possible way forward to stop a bad thing from happening is international pressure, unfortunately. And it doesn't necessarily always, in this context, come from the scientific community. It has to come from the funding community, I think, and which is, the government partners and agencies.
So much, I'll use the word opportunity instead of issue. There's so much opportunity here. And it's great to have had you all here. I think this is just the beginning of this conversation, especially there's several threads that were identified here, I think, that need a deeper look. The background strategic drivers of vulnerability and risk in these areas, the potential role of distributed capacity for early warning. I saw other pieces recently about WhatsApp and SMS. Fantastic there for Joydeep to point that out. It's great having the Earth Journalism Network crew here interfacing with science and expertise. Miriam Matejova from Revkin University and Carleton University. Your lens here is vital too. I'll have to get you on with Alice Hill and my friend Rod Schoonover, who are very much into that. What happens at that high level really matters, especially if it influences what the World Economic Forum does or the World Bank does, and ultimately what governments choose to do. But everything you've said here also points to the importance of what people do. Entrepreneurial, innovative use of social media to get a little warning ahead of these disasters is a vital part of this. So that's it for this morning. Fantastic initial conversation on high mountain vulnerability and where do we go from here. Thanks, Ben Orlove from the Earth Institute, Kashish Das Shrestha, and I can never pronounce your last name as well as I should. What's the best pronunciation?
Shrestha.
Just Shrestha. Shrestha. Okay, sorry. And Ramesh Bhushal from Kathmandu, Joydeep Gupta from Earth Journalism Network, the third poll, a vital source of insights on this story. And I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute of Columbia University, soon to be the climate school here. Much work to be done. So wherever you are, these get archived right away. Look at that scrolling bar at the bottom for ways to get in touch with me with feedback or how to share this. These get archived right away. So share the link you've been watching on with others, and let's build a second show or a third show on this. And stay safe from a distance where necessary, and share insights. Thank you again for being here, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you very
And
much.
good night. Good night to those who are at the end of their days, and good morning to those who are just getting going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.